Hello, my name is Jaclyn Aliperti, and I'm happy to be here to present work on bat-plant interactions based out of University of California, Davis, entitled Pollination Extends to Frugivory in the Pallid Bat, Antrozous pallidus. So as many as are likely aware, bats are well recognized for their role as pollinators and seed dispersers, serving as important agents of plant reproductive success. There are 38 species of bats believed to specialize on nectar and 90 that mostly eat fruit, primarily restricted to the tropics. So this information brings us to the highlighted study system, an area of Baja California Sur, Mexico, where we see an exception, a temperate insectivorous bat that also feeds on nectar. So pallid bats, which are found throughout the Western US and down into Mexico, are specialized for insect feeding. So as you can see here, they have extremely large ears compared to the size of their face. So they could listen to the footsteps or movements of their arthropod prey, and then they swoop down to glean or capture them off the ground. So since most of their prey is gleaned off of the surface instead of captured midair, the structure of their wings is adaptive for maneuverability on the ground. And they also have teeth adapted for crunching down on large hard-shelled prey, and they have an excretory system associated with this protein-rich insect-based diet. And so given the natural history and ecology of the species, you can imagine the surprise when a team of researchers recorded flower visiting behavior across Baja California, and they found this. They discovered that the temperate insect-eating pallid bat frequently drinks nectar from cactus flowers throughout the Baja Peninsula. Looks kind of funny, right? That's because when we think of pollinating species like hummingbirds or other nectar specialists, they typically have evolved a way to hover over a flower while extracting its nectar. But as you can see, pallid bats have short, rounded face. They lack a long rostrum or nose and long tongue, and they can't hover. So instead, they land on top of the flower and they stick their entire head inside of the corolla to feed on nectar. But perhaps unsurprisingly, the scientists also observed lesser long-nosed bats, Leptonicteris yerba, which do specialize in nectar feeding and feed primarily on nectar of columnar cacti. So the interactions among this bat species and columnar cacti have been well studied in Sonora, Mexico, and Leptonicteris yerba is recognized as the primary pollinator of the giant Mexican cardon, or Pachysurias pringlei, which is the tallest cactus in the world and dominant throughout the study system. But to everyone's surprise, even more surprising than finding pallid bats also feeding on the nectar, the scientists found that pallid bats were found to be a more effective pollinator of cardon than the nectar specialist Leptonicteris was. So on the left, we see a lesser long-nosed bat with pollen on its face. And on the right, we see a pallid bat with pollen on its face. Because pallid bats lack adaptations for nectar feeding and they use their whole head and upper bodies to reach the nectar inside of the flower, more pollen presumably gets stuck to their bodies and they bring this pollen with them to the next flower, facilitating reproduction in cardon. So that lends the question, what about fruit? Do pallid bats extend their cactus visiting behavior from visiting flowers for nectar during the spring to visiting fruit to consume pulp and possibly disperse seeds during the summer? So to answer this question, we returned to Baja California, where Frick and other scientists discovered these nectar-feeding pallid bats. And we examined this question more closely at 3 sites in and around Loreto, shown here bounded by a red square. And we performed a 2-part study. One part focused on comparing pallid bats to Leptonicteris in terms of fruit visitation and foraging behavior. And the other part examined the incorporation of fruit into the pallid bat's diet as revealed by stable isotopes. So we know that Leptonicteris have adaptations specialized for nectar feeding and that pallid bats are primarily insectivorous. And so we ask, do pallid bats feed on cactus fruit during the summer? And if pallid's known tendency to feed on cactus nectar during spring extends to feeding on fruit during the summer, then we can examine how visitation rate and fruit removal compares between these 2 species that have very different dietary specializations. So to do this, we collected ripe fruits from cardon, the keystone columnar cactus the bats were known to visit. We used infrared videography equipment with units such as the one pictured here to record nighttime activity at each fruit from sunset to sunrise. And then we collected all fruits and took a series of measurements, including fruit mass. So by comparing the pre and post visitation measurements, we were able to use proportional change in mass as a proxy for seed and pulp removal. Then we matched these data to our videos to confirm which species visited each fruit. And here's what we found. By chance, fruit visitation was divided relatively evenly among 4 groups. So as we see here, out of the 134 fruits studied, roughly 29% were visited solely by Leptonicterus, 19% were visited only by pallid bats, just over 25% by both species, and 26% of fruits were not visited by either species, so these were essentially controls. And this was our first indication that pallid bats are indeed eating fruit. And we were able to get an up-close look at both species' foraging habits on video. So since Leptonicterus had been incredibly well studied in other parts of the Sonoran Desert, we know they eat fruit. And here's a reminder, I guess, of what Leptonicterus look like when they eat the fruit. Unsurprisingly, they feed on fruit much in the same way they sip nectar from flowers. In an incredibly graceful way, they hover over the fruit, feed, and then fly away. In contrast, here's the not so graceful way that pallid bats visit fruit, which I like to call the grab and gorge approach. So here a pallid can be seen wrapping its wings around the fruit's outer spines and then sticking its head inside to take a bite before letting go and flying away. In some cases, the pallid bat misses the fruit entirely and collides with the cactus. And sometimes the pallid bat lands on a fruit just to not so pleasantly discover that someone else is already there. A common pallid strategy seems to be to crawl completely inside of the fruit. This individual stayed inside this fruit for several minutes, just eating its until its heart content, and then it climbed out eventually. Although at times this does seem to be tricky. In this case, a pallid bat actually got its head stuck inside of the fruit on its way back out. However clumsy they appear to be, pallid bats do get the job done. Believe it or not, this is the same, this is the before and after photo of the same fruit that the pallid bat from one of the previous videos crawled inside. It went from being completely full to bare, having lost 79 grams worth of pulp and seeds. So now that we know pallid bats are consuming fruit, we have to wonder, is this opportunistic insectivore just as frugivorous as Leptonicterus, which co-evolved with cacti, the nectar specialists? So of over 3,500 total recorded bat visits to fruit, visitation was nearly split down the middle between the 2 species, with pallid bats consuming 51% of the, comprising 51% of the visits, and Leptonicterus making up the remaining 49%. And when comparing how much fruit each species removed, we found that the answer is yes. When plotting the proportion of fruit mass removed each night as a function of which species was visiting that fruit, we find that pallid bats were removing just as much fruit mass as Leptonicterus, averaging between 9 and 11% of fruit mass removal each night. So our data reveal that pallid bats are consuming roughly the same amount of fruit as Leptonicterus, but how important is fruit in their diet? So we answered this question in the second part of our study by using stable isotope analysis. Cacti perform CAM photosynthesis, as many here probably are aware, which generates distinct ratios of 13C over 12C compared to plants that use C3 photosynthesis. So therefore, we can use stable isotopes to get a CAM-based signal that's indicative of carbon derived from a cactus pathway versus C3-based carbon that's derived from a more insectivorous or arthropod-based diet. So CAM signals have a higher or less negative weighted C13 values, whereas C3 signals have a lower or more negative weighted C13 values. So for this part of the study, we misnetted pallid bats and took samples of exhaled breath and wing tissue for analysis. Exhaled breath provided an immediate signal of what the bat was eating over the course of the past few hours, while wing tissue provides a longer-term signal of what the bat was eating over the scale of days to even months. So we were able to compare weighted carbon values collected during summer to known values collected by Frick and other scientists during winter and spring. We then used a Bayesian isotopic mixing model in program R to calculate what percent of the bat's diet came from cactus-derived nutrients, and then we compared our findings across summer sites. So seen here are isotopically weighted carbon values for breath and tissue samples collected from pallids during winter, during spring, and during summer. So remember that the high C13 values indicate more of a cactus-based diet, while the lower C13 values indicate more of a C3-based insectivorous diet. So we found a significant difference in weighted carbon values across all seasons for breath and across all seasons, except between summer and winter for tissue. Whereas during the spring, there was relatively little variation in carbon isotope ratios in both breath and wing tissues. There was much higher variation in the summer, which implies there's likely more individual variation and reliance on fruit. In other words, it appears that all of the pallid bats are sipping a little bit on nectar in the spring, but this doesn't seem to be the case for summer breath. Some individuals are having very strong CAM signals, and some individuals don't have any CAM signals. And that's what we see there. And here we see the results of our mixing model showing the mean percentage of the diet that's derived from can-based carbon, which in this case would essentially be the percent of the diet comprised of cactus fruit across our 3 sites. So the values shown here all came from pallid breath rather than tissue samples to get that more immediate estimate of what they were eating during the summer. And in looking at spatial variation in CAM values, we did see some regional differences. Individuals captured at the Santo Domingo site have relatively low values of fruit in the breath, although this was a small sample of only a few individuals compared to a much higher percentage of fruit in the diet at San Basilio. And when we did the same comparison across wing tissue samples to see a longer-term view of nutrients in the diet, we found that even bats that have lower signals of fruit in their breath still have a leftover signal of CAM-based carbon in their tissue. So this tells us that the same bats that may not be eating fruit during summer were in fact drinking nectar during spring. So this further supports our finding of a wide individual variation in pallid bats' diet. So in summary, we confirmed that fruit is important to the pallid bat diet during summer. And so adding on to the Frick et al. Nectarivory study, we now see that their diet is dependent on cacti across 2 different seasons, with more variation in the fruit-based diet during summer than in the nectar-based diet during the spring. So future studies should more closely examine which biotic and abiotic factors significantly influence bat visits to fruit, as well as compare foraging efficiency between pallid bats and leptonictors on fruit during summer. And germination studies can also enable us to more fully examine or determine what role bats play for the cactus, as well as how opportunistic dietary habits influence mutualist network dynamics in this system. Nonetheless, it's clear that pallid bats are important mutualists and part of this network in Baja California Sur with the cacti there. And so with that, I look forward at the end of this session to hopefully taking any questions that you may have. I want to thank you for inviting me to give this talk here today. And I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge my collaborators who worked with me on this project. Winifred Frick, Douglas Kelt, Paul Heedy are all co-authors on this paper, which was ultimately published in the Journal of Mammalogy. And I also like to acknowledge the Wildlife, Fish, and Conservation Biology Department at University of California, Davis, who helped to fund this study. As well as Bat Conservation Research and Services, the American Museum of Natural History, the Davis Botanical Society, Rodrigo Medellin, who helped us with our permitting in Mexico, as well as my wonderful undergraduate assistants, Natalie Neff, Hallie Daly, Cameron McCoppin, Greg Forrest, Leah Burtz, Flor Calderon, all of whom helped me analyze all of the video, many videos of bats visiting cacti. So with that, thank you again, and happy to take any questions.